WayGen. And WayGen stands for Wayland Genealogy, and it's a group, very active group, that meets here on the second and fourth Tuesday of every month. And we thoroughly enjoyed having them, and periodically we like to do collaboratives with them where we have a speaker and invite residents in to learn about WayGen and to learn about a particular topic. Today's speaker is Seema Kenny. And Seema, correct me if I'm wrong, you went through the BU genealogy certificate program back maybe 9 or 10 years ago?
Yeah.
And have since become very involved in everything genealogy. So today we are discussing immigration and naturalization, and I turn the program over to Seema. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Julie. Thank you for having me back. I forget how many times I've been here now.
Turn the mic on.
Oh, it's not? Okay, turn it up more.
And reposition it if they can't hear you.
How's that? Better?
Yeah.
Oh, okay. There we go.
Oh, it's
All
too
right.
loud.
Oh, there's some people way in the back.
So, yes, as Julie said, I did do the program at BU, and I am now a member of at least 6 organizations. I think I'm an officer in 4 of those, so yes, I've gone way into the deep end of the genealogy pool. And I'll promote one of those. I hope to see a lot of you up in New Hampshire in a couple of weeks when we have our regional conference up there for 4 days of genealogical fun. We have over 800 people signed up to come, so
Wow.
lots of friends and family to meet and lots of genealogical things to do for the 3rd through the 6th of April. So, let's see. I hope those little leprechauns aren't in the way there. So immigration and naturalization was the topic that Julie had asked for today. So I have this divided into 2 sections. Obviously, we'll talk about immigration first because people have to immigrate before they can naturalize, right? I hope we've got that step down. So we'll look at some of the basics, some of the facts about immigration. We were having a discussion a little bit earlier about trying to break through a brick wall, and I made the comment that if you can't find the genealogical records, sometimes it's time to look at the historical aspect of that information. So a lot of this is the historical about, when could somebody come in, what would happen when they came in. I do have some information on Ellis Island as well as Castle Garden in here to share with you. And then we'll look at pretty much the same kind of thing with naturalization. Used to do this for the Boy Scouts for one of their merit badges. They had to learn about citizenship in the United States, and most of them did not know that there were 6 ways you could become a naturalized or become a citizen of the United States. So that was always an early learning experience for them. Like, what? There's more ways than just like being born here? Like, yeah, just because you took the easy one, there are others. And we should know about those because depending how that happened and where your ancestor was at the time might impact how they felt about it and whether they considered themselves a citizen or not. So let's start with immigration. If we're talking about immigration prior to 1820, okay, there's really no regulation. Unless you were coming from someplace outside the British Empire, you really weren't immigrating. You were just traveling to another part of the empire. Right? Our people that were here for the people that were here for the Revolutionary War, they were in Britain when they were here. They weren't in another country, and they didn't come from another country, so you're not going to find all the same kind of documents and things. So it's not until we get into later areas where we start to have some acts, right? We need a government first to enact some of these laws and things, so we have to think that way, like what was the state of the U.S. government? And baby governments don't necessarily have all the same rules that teenage and adult governments have, right? My husband and I just started rewatching Designated Survivor, the TV show where the Capitol blows up and this guy that was a no-name cabinet person becomes he had to start from scratch, so it's kind of like watching George Washington. He's got to build up the whole government. So you got to think about there's priorities you're going to deal with, and immigration may or may not have been a top priority for some of those first few presidents. So it really isn't until we get this Steerage Act in 1819 that we start to get regulations about even providing a list of information about people that were on your ship. And even then, it was bare bones information, and it's as over time that the states, because at this point, up until 1890, it's still the states that are controlling immigration. So certainly a landlocked state probably is paying no attention to immigration, because how were people going to get there? They were all going to come from inside the country, unless they were along the Canadian border, but, you know. So limited amounts, and they went to the port, to the person that was in charge of the port. So sometimes these were custom houses. If we're talking like in Boston, there was a customs house. Things would get turned in there to the director. But if it was a smaller port, they just got turned into whoever's in charge of the port. Who knows who that was? Who knows where those records all ended up? It's another mystery to kind of chase down where they might be. Hopefully, they've gotten turned over to the federal government and they're in the National Archives by now, but I'm not going to guarantee that. So it's not until 1890 when the federal government takes over immigration. So right there, you know that if you're looking before 1890, you're looking for state documents and not federal documents.
They're at the National Archives.
They could be at the National Archives.
Right.
Hopefully they got turned over, if they still existed.
Don't discourage people that you can't get anything at the
Well,
National Archives.
No, but we got to know what haystack we're looking in,
No.
right? So at that time, it was the U.S. Office of Immigration. Of course, it's changed names about 6 times. So we got to keep up with what are the names. People that are watching the federal government will have a little more information for you there. They did change the forms frequently, and every time they changed the forms, basically they asked for more information.
Right.
So we hope our ancestors came a little bit more recently because we get more information on the forms, but you know, they came when they came. We can't do much about it. So if we're looking, especially in federal documents, right, we also have to remember that a lot of this, what we're looking for, was done all on paper, and a lot of it was done prior to the early 1900s. Well, I went to an institute down at the National Archives about 10 years ago, and it was a week-long thing. Boy, you think you get brain dead at the conference after 3 days. You should try 5 or 6 days in Washington. By Thursday, we went over to National Archives 2, which is at University of Maryland in College Park. And this guy got dragged in the morning to substitute. He came in and he asked us a question. He says, have you figured out yet why most of the federal records change in the early 1900s? And if you've done any work with federal records, you'll notice that, oh yeah, before this date, you look them up this way. After this date, you look them up that way. We were all brain dead. It was early in the morning. We didn't know what the heck. We just stared at the guy until he finally told us that's when they invented the file cabinet.
The what?
The file cabinet.
Oh, file cabinet.
So if you can file in a filing cabinet, your system changes, which is why a lot of these things in the early federal records, you're going to see where things have changed. So most of what we're looking for, these are in big log books. So they're not in order by anything other than the date. That's great. I want to know when they came. How can I look it up if I don't know the date, right? Then maybe they're in order by the port, the ship, you know. But hopefully, if we're ready to look for this, we have some guesses and we have some idea of the name of the passenger we're looking for, maybe several names, some idea of when they might have gotten here. You know, it had to be, if they're an immigrant, after they're born and before we found some first American document that they're in. Maybe we have an idea what age they are, because those are 3 of the things that are typically on the documents that we're looking at, which is going to help us to tell which John Smith we're looking for. Did we find the right one? Or any of those Norwegian names we were talking about, or anything else, right? And it helps to know, here's some history, right? Most people that came over, they came in the spring. So we're looking at March, April, May was the busiest time. If they didn't come then, the second most popular was to come in September, October, November. gee, I can't imagine they didn't want to travel in January, February, you know, what's their problem? A lot of them came with traveling companions. So if you haven't heard it before, you know, branching out to that fan club, their friends, associates, their neighbors, you know, who might they have traveled with? If you have some idea, that helps sometimes to have another name that can help you to narrow down you've got the right people. Now, of course, ships didn't go from point A to point B. They sometimes stopped at points C, D, E, and F. So just because they said the ship came to Boston doesn't mean it didn't land in Gloucester or Portland or go to Newport, right? Ever pick up a brochure for a conference or a training session around here, and sometimes they'll say, oh, on the cover it'll say, you know, Boston, Hartford, New York, and you open it up and they're going to be in Worcester. Anybody that lives in Massachusetts knows that Worcester is not Boston, right? But they have to advertise for the big cities, for the airports, so they put Boston on the cover even though, so this is no different. The shipping lines are going to say Boston, but that doesn't mean it's the only place they went. So sometimes we have to think about, well, all right, they said they came to Boston, but then again, great-grandma was 5, and did she really? Maybe she came in, you know, one of these other ports we have to look at. We also want to look at the steamship lines and departure points. Again, go back to looking at the history. What steamship lines came from the country that your immigrant came from? There are probably only 2 or 3, right? If you get a history of that steamship company, you might get some information that points you to the next clue. Oh, well, they only came from that port to this port, or maybe to these 3 ports. Well, okay, now you know that they must have come into one of those 3. Or they only went from Sweden to England, so I know my ancestors, yes, they left from Sweden, but they went to England, then they had to cross across the country, and then leave England to come to America. So they're Swedish, but they're in the British records for a good 6 months anyway, before they got to America. So I can look at some of that from a travel pattern standpoint. I can look it up by the steamship lines, which might even get me to a ship. Ships' histories are much more well documented than some of these passenger lists. So looking up a ship and finding out how big it was, when was it made, when was it decommissioned, some of that will help, again, narrow you down to a date, or at least a range of dates. So let's look at some of the regulations that our government put in, right? All kinds of neat things they wanted to do. So New York was obviously one of the bigger ports. And they did do a lot of processing even before the federal government took over. They had a processing place called Castle Garden. I have a picture of it to show you. And they actually processed about 8 million people at Castle Garden. So if you think your ancestors came into New York and it was prior to Ellis Island, you probably want to check Castle Garden, because that's a good logical place for them to have started. And then by the 1900s, we start putting in all these laws. Now, I haven't looked all of these up to get all the specifics, right? This came out of a few books I read that gave me some general ideas. And I think some of these are a little easier to get around than others. Because let's face it, if what they're saying is, oh, we're not going to let in an anarchist, well, then don't tell them that you are one. I mean, how are they going to know, right? It's not like you've got a big A on your forehead or on your sweater or whatever, right? So we've got, you know, a little bit of leeway here. I don't think any of these are perfectly good, like keep you out kinds of things. But mental and physical disabilities. You know, the whole reason to process people was to say, if you're not healthy, we don't want you coming in and getting our people sick. We can be very mean as a country, you know, and this is like our topic of being really mean. If you've got mental disabilities, if you're a young child coming over all by yourself, no, you're going to go get sent back. No, I'm not kidding. They really did send people back. But the thing to remember is when they sent somebody back, it was the shipping company that had to pay for that person to go back. So what do you think the shipping company did before the people got on the boat? dumb, right? They don't want to spend this money having people come back. It's one thing if you get sick on the voyage, you know, they probably could have helped, but certainly not 100% avoidable. 1917, we start testing people. If you're 17 or older, we want to make sure you can read and write. It doesn't say read and write English. We want to know that you're educated so you can get a job and you can support yourself and the government doesn't have to pay for you, right? These are our big things. We don't want people coming here regardless of what the Statue of Liberty says about give me your poor and all. We really don't want the poor. We'll take the destitute, but not the poor, or whichever is, you know, less bad, I don't know. The 1910 census. Anybody use that for your genealogy? Look people up? All right. You look up at the page, right, that has names and dates on it and information. Every census also has statistics, even the ones that are not yet published. There are statistics you can look at about the census. So the 1910 census was taken, right, on paper, pre-computers, so they had to tabulate it by hand, employed a whole lot of people, I'm sure, to do it. They came up with statistics. How many people in the United States came from such and such a country? Well, they used that statistic in 1921 to start establishing quotas of how many people could come from a given country. So if your ancestors came after 1921 and it looks a little funny on their passenger list, like they say they came from somewhere that you know they didn't really ever live, maybe they told a little white lie, because I'd rather tell a white lie and get in the door than tell the truth and be sent back home. Right? We always have to question a document. What were the advantages if they lied? What were the consequences if they lied? What were the consequences? What were the consequences, you know, of telling the truth? And I'm sorry, if I got here and the truth was going to make me go home, yeah, I'm going to lie. You know, if it's because you have to be, you know, if you're a woman unmarried, you have to be a certain age to get through the door, you bet I'm going to be that age. You're not going to force me to get married on Ellis Island just to let me through the door. And they did do that. There are a lot of marriages performed on Ellis Island because the rule was if you were unattached female, you did not get in without having proof that you were either going to get married or having your fiance there, and sometimes that meant you got married on the island. So there's a lot of things to kind of think about with, you know, all these different laws, and this is just a skimming of them. So by 1950, of course, now we're post-World War II, right? So don't admit that you're a communist or a fascist. Again, don't bring this stuff with you. I don't know, pack it in the suitcase, hide it somewhere, right? Don't bring it. It's 1965 when we abolish quotas. Some will say, look what that did for us. You know, maybe it was good, maybe it was bad. That's a whole other discussion, right? We're not here to talk about the current immigration system. We want to look at some of these older issues that we have to deal with for research. All right? So we need to know some of these things. We need to know, understand what the culture was, what the feeling of the society was as to who was coming in. You know, we've all seen the signs we all studied in school, no Irish need apply and all that kind of stuff, but lived through the, you know, no long-haired freaky people, whatever that song is. It goes way back before us. So we're looking for passenger lists, right? But they may not exist. So other places we can look, of course, these are going to depend on where your ancestor came from and when they came. But there are plenty of places, if you stop and think about all the forms you filled out in your lifetime, how many places could I go and find a form that has your birth date on it? I bet it's a pretty long list, right? Everything since kindergarten registration. So these people were putting information on a lot of these forms. We just have to stop and think about what other forms could we look at. So did they get a land grant from the government where they might have been asked when they immigrated? Did they come over as an indentured servant? Maybe I need to look at those lists, right? Especially if they came over as a younger child, they may have a contract. I've actually seen some where there are some of those indentured servant contracts that still exist. Did they ever take an oath of allegiance? Now that would have been more in the late early 1800s, but if you know what port city they came in, have you looked at the newspapers? Some of those newspapers would do big articles when a ship came in. Came in from such and such a place with so many passengers. It might highlight a few passengers. I doubt it's going to list all 1,000 people that were on the ship. But it might highlight a few. But it might also just give you an idea of, oh, well, how often did a ship come from that country? And how often did a ship come? It might be another place to get the information on what shipping lines. Because if you read the port newspapers, it should be telling you, you know, this ship from this country came, and maybe, again, the ship's name will lead you back to something. If they voted, depending again on what time frame, voter registration may have immigration information. If they came and did a homestead, right? So these would be people who probably ended up living west of the Mississippi. But if they went for that homesteading where the government was going to give you property as long as you promised to live there and build it up and do good things with it, their application may have immigration information. It might not be the place you think to look, but it's worth looking. If it's after 1940, have you looked for their passport application? Even if you already know when they came, but it was after 1940, go look for their passport application. It has a photograph. If you haven't seen a photograph, you want to get a photograph, right? Just remember it's on page 2. Make sure you go to the second page to find that photograph. Some of them are hysterical. I found one day, high society lady, I'm sure. She's got a hat on that goes like this. You can see one eye and half her nose. So, oh yeah, that'll pass for identification. But I know she was a high society lady just by looking at that picture. You know, she had the big beautiful hat and that was her passport picture. I don't know how she got away with it. Wouldn't work today. And if it is, you know, after the 1940s, you've got European passports too. So explore whether you can find something on that side. You know, they didn't just immigrate to the United States, they emigrated from some other country, and that country may have records as well. So we have to look in those 2 places. So we do have some passenger lists for most of the major ports. And for a long time, believe it or not, Philadelphia was the biggest port in the United States. So just because you think they came into New York doesn't mean they didn't come into Philadelphia, because that was a very busy place. So that might be another thing to just kind of expand your horizons and look for what you can find from Philadelphia. Of course, there's ports all up and down the East Coast. You've got the Gulf Coast. We've also got, you know, Western things. But we're in New England. We're going to assume our ancestors, at least for today, came in, you know, somewhere around here as well. So here's a list of just some of the places that might have been port cities that people may have come in. And my line did not mean to cross off Galveston. It's supposed to be under Galveston, not crossing it off. Just separating out, you know, there's 4 ports in Canada that people could have come into. Think about when you book a trip. If you're going to book an overseas trip, do you necessarily go to the most direct place, or do you go to the place you can afford? It may have been cheaper for people to come to Canada, work for 6 months to a year, and then, you know, walk down or ride down to the United States. So we have to think about, again, what was life like in their time frame and what would they have been able to do? We know they didn't hop on an airplane, most of them, but, you know, if we're talking about older records. So if we're looking for things in the federal records, the National Archives are going to be arranged, again, by the port and then the date. That doesn't help most of us because those are usually the things we're trying to find. It doesn't mean you shouldn't look. It just means you need to understand how their records are organized so that when you go in, you have some idea of how long it's going to take you to find some of these things. Now, some of these federal records have been indexed, and that helps, but not all of them. And we just want to keep in mind that, you know, they didn't have the same filing systems and things that we have today. So a lot of people want to know, well, all right, my ancestors went to Canada and they came over. Well, you know, we don't hear much today about the Canadian border and people coming across. It's not a big deal. We really didn't start doing much with them until the 1860s, and even then, let's face it, there's plenty of woods people can walk through and nobody's going to know that you came across the border, right? Mexican crossings, we didn't really start till 1903, keeping track. Of course not. We had to settle everything with with Mexico first, right? And get Texas and deal with knowing where the border was before we could track most of it. So think about doing both sides. Look for emigration as well as immigration, right? The E is for exiting, the I is for coming in. So we want to look at both of those sides. And I think this is where I added, yeah. So here's a picture of Castle Garden. It's a nice round building that is not really there anymore, certainly not in this shape. If you go down to New York City and you go to Battery Park to get a ticket to go to the Statue of Liberty, this is where you buy your ticket. Except it doesn't look anything like that anymore because the building's pretty much crumbled and whatever, but this was a much bigger picture and I focused in. I mean, look at all these people coming out of the building. You know, you can tell that these are the immigrants and they're getting on these little tiny boats or, you know, going wherever, right? So this is a place that was used up until 1890 for the state of New York, if you came into the port. You didn't have to come into the port to be in New York, but it would have been a starting point. And then, of course, Ellis Island afterwards. This is what Ellis Island looked like back in the late 1700s. Ellis Island originally, when it was first purchased by the guy named Ellis, was 3 acres. It's now 27 acres. But that's a whole other talk. We won't. But I stole these pictures from that talk. And then, of course, this is, you know, what it looks like today, and hopefully it will keep improving and they'll keep opening more and more of these buildings so we can look at this wonderful history that's there. So here's what I have found for other places that had a processing station like Ellis Island. There was one in Baltimore Harbor, so not too far from New York. One in San Francisco and one in Galveston, Texas. I'm not saying these are all of them, but this is the list I was able to find. I have no idea, have not found anything that says any of these actually still exist to visit the way that Ellis Island does. So I think it's a matter of, you know, who got to it and who decided to preserve what.
You can still visit Castle Garden.
Well, you can, what's left of it. It's not, there's not much there.
If you Google it on your computer, you can get quite a bit of information about it.
Oh, yeah.
Picture of the current place, and it's a park and everything, yeah.
Yeah.
And there was a processing station in East Boston, but it doesn't exist anymore. It's seldom mentioned.
Yeah, I'm going to have to go look that one up, add it to this slide. So if your ancestors were coming into Ellis Island, right, there's first of all a limited amount of time that they could have been processed at Ellis Island because it wasn't open all that long, even though it did a lot of people. And the only people that went through Ellis Island are the ones who came in third class or what was known as steerage, right? So it's the poorest people.
Right.
If you were rich enough to buy a first class or a second class ticket, you didn't go to Ellis Island. You got off the boat on the other side of the harbor. If you were in the steerage, when you got off at that side of the harbor, you got on a barge that came to Ellis Island. So when they got off, the people from steerage, right, they would get information. Usually it got pinned to their back shoulder, right? You see those people with safety pins and papers on their back, whatever. It was the information they provided getting on the boat, and they had to provide the same information getting off the boat. You know, this is identity theft control. I think we should have such a thing these days. A lot of people got through in 3 to 5 hours. Other people could be there for days or weeks. Depends on what their issues were, right? And there were times when people didn't even go through Ellis Island, even though it was open. When there was a big contagious disease out there, they didn't even bring people to Ellis Island right away, if at all. So I haven't looked up yet what the issue was in 1892, but they had a great description of it there that, let me get this up of the corner. In 1892, when I'm assuming there was some kind of flu going on, some pandemic of some sort, they actually would stop at one of these other two islands, the ships coming in. They would raise a flag, which meant they were ready for an inspection. Everybody gets off, gets on a little barge, gets disinfected, and they go back on the ship. Maybe for 3-4 days.
Oh, that was influenza.
And then they'd come back and say, okay, if nobody's sick, now the ship can come further in, and we'll let everybody get off.
It wasn't a sailing ship in 1818.
So you've got, a little bit of extra inspection going on. 1918, 1919, of course, we know that's the Spanish flu. And in that case, they didn't let people off, they just did the inspections on the ships. Seems kind of backwards to me, because if there's people with the disease, you're walking right into the disease. I would think all your inspectors are going to get sick, but to each their own. They did make accommodations. So here's the actual dates. If somebody came through Ellis Island, they had to come between 1892 and the middle of 1897, or between 1900, let's say 1901, because December, up through 1924. That's really not that many years, if you think about how long we're looking to go back and trace people. So it really is a short, and the break here from 97 to 1900 is because there was, of course, we're genealogists, we know, there was a fire and Ellis Island burnt. And then they built a brick building that wouldn't burn. So for that 2.5 years that it took them to build the building, they obviously couldn't process anyone there because it was under construction. They got a little break. So let's say, okay, we found our ancestors, we know they're here, now we want to look at what happens when they get here. How do they become citizens? Well, we've got 3 different areas or time frames we want to look at. If they came between 1790 and 1850, then we know it was done at the state level. We know a lot of people during that didn't have to naturalize because they were already from Great Britain, United Kingdom, whatever. So it wasn't as big a deal for them. 1850 to 1906, we've got one set of regulations and ways that things are done. 1906 to the present, we've got another one. So we want to have some idea here what we're looking at so that we know what things to look for. 6 ways to become naturalized, or to become a citizen, I should say. Right? Most of us probably took the first one. We were born here. All right? Thank you, Mom and Dad. We know where we were when we were born. But you can get naturalized in a court, which is what we normally think of when we're talking about naturalization and looking for papers. We're looking for court records. You can also have it derived because of your parents or a marriage. You can have it because you got acquisition. Your parent might have been serving abroad, but they were a U.S. citizen, right? We have military that have babies overseas. They're still U.S. citizens. You could get it by legislation or by annexation. And those are 2 that we don't always think about, but could make a big difference in where we do our research and how we research for our genealogy. So I'm going to start and work my way back up here from the bottom up to the court system of what we would do with these. Now, annexation. Anybody have ancestors that might have been in the South or in the West, as opposed to? Okay, good. Dale's got at least one we can talk about. So, U.S. history class way back when, right, we learned about, Louisiana Purchase, right? And it was a lot bigger than what we think of as Louisiana. Big, huge piece of land, right? Yeah, okay, so in 1803, anybody who lived there went to bed a French citizen and woke up an American citizen. Do they consider themselves naturalized? What do they put on the census for citizenship? Might make a big difference on how they felt about all that going on, right? So you could find somebody who writes on the census, oh yes, I was naturalized. Yeah, but maybe it was just because the United States bought the land they were living on. It doesn't necessarily mean they went through a court process, right? I'm not saying they all did this, but I'm saying we got to think about this way. You know, Florida, we purchased it or gained it, whatever, in 1819, which includes what's now Mississippi and Alabama. Alaska, 1867. These could all be things where people, again, overnight, their citizenship changes, just like anybody who went to court, it changes in a moment that the judge says, yes, you're a citizen, right? But how do they feel about it, and what do they mark down about it? Would make a difference on whether we're going to go find any other documents or not. These are people who wouldn't have had to go to court. They became American citizens without ever asking. Try to remember not to look for things that you'll never find, because that's just frustrating and a waste of your time, and you have enough other things to look for if you're trying to do your genealogy, right? We don't need to look for what we can't find. So then we've got legislation. If you were in Texas, Hawaii, Puerto Rico, the Virgin Islands, if you were a slave, if you were an American Indian, Congress passed some laws that got signed in, and bingo, you're a citizen. So again, we've got to think about, are these things that the people would treat and say on the census, yes, I was naturalized, or are they going to say, I'm not naturalized, and great, you're not chasing something that doesn't exist? Because again, these people are not going to have court files. They may have them, but there's no guarantee. They got citizenship without going to court. But the ones we really care about, the ones we want to go looking for, are those people who got it through the court system. They went through the 3 or 4 step process, filed all the paperwork, and that's what we want to track down, right? Especially if we know that great-grandma was really proud because they got the certificate and all of that. So, 3-step process. File a declaration. You had to have been here for a certain amount of time first. You weren't supposed to just get off the boat and then fill out the paper. I don't say that people didn't do that, because people certainly did, but that wasn't the rule. So you filed a declaration. Then you waited long enough, whatever the current rules were at the time, and you did your petition. And you say to the court, I've been here, I've been a good person, I've done this, I've done that, here's my witnesses, and I want to be a U.S. citizen. That's the document that you want to find if you can. That's the document that has all the good, juicy genealogical details that we want, right? And then the 3rd step is the judge calls you in and says, yes, I'm going to make you a citizen, and you get to take your oath and you get your fancy certificate. And I don't mean to belittle anyone who's gotten one of those fancy certificates. They're beautiful pieces of paper, and I know they mean the world to somebody. But genealogically, who cares? They've got a date on it. That's it. They have the date that you became a citizen. I want this juicy one that tells me when did you come here, who came with you, how'd you get here, where'd you come from? Well, the date's good, but I want the other good stuff that's hard to find, right? As do most of us. We want the details.
What is there a name for the petition the court for citizenship? Is there a name to that document?
That's the name. It's the petition for citizenship.
Okay.
Yep. I actually have samples to show you, too. I'll show you my brother-in-law, who didn't know how darn lucky he was till I took all his research from him.
You erased it.
No. Can't erase it. So there are rules, right? If it was 1802, and this is, again, we've got to know what rules applied when in order to figure out where we're looking. You could fill in your declaration, but then you had to wait 3 years. And then you had to do something and then wait 5 years to get your petition. So we've got time frames here. So what does that mean? If it takes you 8 years from step 1 to step 3, are you necessarily in the same place? Of course not. Opportunity was knocking. These people were moving. Just because they did all 3 steps doesn't mean they did them at the same courthouse. It doesn't even mean they did them in the same state. They weren't doing this to make it easy for us to follow. However, if you find all the pages, you're going to follow where they were. We've got 1860, if woman marries an alien, she loses her US citizenship, and she might have to reapply later. After the husband either applies or dies, she might want to become a US citizen again. So you might find citizenship papers, naturalization papers for people that were born in the United States, especially females, because they actually lost their citizenship. I don't know about these Asians. They got all kinds of immigration and naturalization issues here for those Asians. Someday I'll do a history research about what was going on between the US and the Asians there. Starting in 1906, there was a new program where you could actually get a certificate of arrival. Now, if you have one of those, yay, because that's usually typed, or at least nicely printed, way nicer than the passenger list, and it usually has the same information or most of what was on the passenger list. So if you find the certificate of arrival, that can sometimes substitute for that passenger list. Now, identity theft. We all know what that is, right? Because it's been in the news for the last 5 or 6 years of computers. Well, it was going on back here too. Imagine you don't have a little license in your back pocket, with your picture on it, right? You know that John Brown came in on such and such a ship on such and such a day because maybe he was one of those people that was written up in the newspaper or something. Oh, I look enough like him. I got the same hair, the same color eyes, whatever. You go to court, you use his name to get your petition processed. These certificates of arrival were part of the combating of identity theft and having 16 people try to use John Brown's passenger list to get their certification or naturalization, because obviously there was only one John Brown on that boat. Well, maybe there were more, but hopefully they're different ages or something. So this was a governmental thing that you may or may not find. What happens in 1920? Ladies? We get to vote, right? Now we have to get citizenship in our own name. We can't just get it because our husband's got it. Right? And that's another thing to look for. The wives and the kids who got their citizenship because their father or husband got it. Right? That's citizenship by derivation. So we want to be looking for those. And yes, of course, 1924, we had to put in some kind. We quoted the immigration. We better quote a naturalization as well, I don't know. Too many people were going to vote? Who knows? And of course, there are exceptions to every rule. If you have an ancestor who served in the U.S. military, even though they were not a U.S. citizen, there's a good chance they got exceptions to almost every rule on here. Yeah. And probably got citizenship either the day before or the day after they were discharged from the military. And I'm not saying whether that's good or bad, it's something that happened, and hey, if they served for our country, why not give them citizenship? Who knows? So,
Can I make a suggestion to add to your previous list?
Sure.
1936, when women who lost their citizenship because they were married to an alien, if they were divorced or he had died, they could reapply to become U.S. citizens.
So 1936, the women who lost
They have those records for
reapply.
U.S. District Court of Boston at Waltham.
Okay. So we had to look for those
And
too.
I had, the reason I discovered them because I was typing up an index for them, but I discovered a relative that I didn't even know about and was very surprised. I think, Oh, there you are. You have somebody who
I
had that,
do,
yeah.
but mine got it, after 1922. She got it in 1922
Yeah.
when she applied, and so I was surprised because, they couldn't vote. That was the only thing that was stopping them. I thought she wouldn't care, but obviously she wanted to be naturalized.
Yeah.
If you look at some of the political things that were going on, some of the presidential elections and even some of the state elections, you can see from the coverage why a lot of women might have tried to get citizenship right before a certain election. I have one, actually, my sample of my husband's great aunt. She did it. And I think she did it because of an election. So the deal originally was, in order to get naturalized, you had to go to a court. Now that sounds pretty straightforward, doesn't it? Until you look up what was a court. It wasn't a big fancy building like we think of today with columns and all these people and judges and whatever. It was any organization run by the government that kept a record. Let that sink in. Any organization by the government that kept a record could naturalize somebody. How far are you going to travel to get naturalized? Not very far, right? You're a farmer, probably. You're going to the local place. So it could have been a county, federal, city, marine, police court. These are all names of different courts that used to exist. Different numbers of them depending on how far back you go. You know, it used to be there was only one federal court in a large geographic area, and then they would split it in half and you'd end up with two, kind of like our area codes that we grew up with, right? You know, so here's another place where if you're trying to look for these papers and you don't know what you're headed for, especially if they're pre-federal, you need to look at the history of the court system in that area where you think your people were located. And it doesn't mean that it has to be in the same state. If they live near the border, you want to know, okay, well, what courts, whatever those were close enough in the next state, because maybe they took a half a day and went to that state to do their paperwork, you know, even though they never lived there. Because let's face it, who's going to travel 2 days to get this done if I can travel 1 day, right? You don't know how long you're going to wait, but you got to get there, you got to deal with the papers, and you got to get home. The shorter amount of time, the better. At least that's how our lives work. I can't imagine theirs were much different. So again, we're looking up that history kind of aspect of things. Now, if you're going to the National Archives, and maybe even in some courthouses, if you can find where they might have some of these in their dark, dusty basements, before computers, somebody created a system and they called it Soundex. This was how they indexed things, right? So we could find them later. Yay, somebody was thinking ahead. So there's a part of your handout has the words, the codes for this. It's not that hard to learn. But you keep the first letter of the name, and then you add 3 numbers. And the numbers are added according to what other consonants are in your name. Double consonants only count as 1. So for instance, if I do my name, I get K500. But you notice when I first moved to Massachusetts and I said my name was Kenny, people go, oh, Kenny, like the shoes? No, Kenny, like make it the I and E. But you notice if I make it an I get the same number. So if somebody mistook the writing and wrote it out as Kinney versus Kenny, all I have to do is go through the K500s and I'm going to find both spellings. Well, isn't that great if your name is Smith, that's sometimes with an I and sometimes with a Y? Or any of those other things that sometimes ends in an E but not always ends in an E, you know, they're all going to be under the same number. So you're going to get all those spelling variations, which is exactly what they were going for. You notice if I go to Kennedy, because there's another consonant in there, now it's under K530. That's important for me to know because especially in Massachusetts, a lot of people write my name, they still do, and say, oh yeah, Seema Kennedy. No, there's no D. Take the D out. Thought I got away with that when I got married and got rid of my maiden name, but it didn't work. You know, so here's another example I did, the word Schaefer. which could be spelled certainly multiple ways. I'm sure if you're researching it, you've probably seen multiple spellings, but the sound X comes out exactly the same. So once you determine it and you look through all those numbers that match, you're looking through a variety of spellings. Somebody was really smart when they figured this out, weren't they? Oh, seems so simple now. So you want to be aware of this because there are still areas where you will find things filed this way. Yes, sir.
I am looking for my ancestors from Greece. They lived in an island in Turkey. But what I discovered in my research that the spellings of people's names can be dramatically different because, for instance, my grandfather's name was Iphilonis, and that V could be, I'm sorry, the V could have been a B, and so you may want to look into people with Iphilonis.
Absolutely. When
Yeah.
you're looking up, no matter what what ethnicity, when you're looking up names and you're seeing, oh, wait, one person spelled it this way, you want to be keeping a list of all those different spellings because you're going to have to look them up under all those different ones.
Well, I do remember that my grandmother's first name was spelled maybe 10 different ways. Her actual name was Epimofula, that was her first name, which means beautiful, to Morphia, all the way down to Mobili. So you can't always follow what the spellings are. The other thing too is on a ship manifest, where people came from can vary because I know in looking back 100 years ago, depending on like the Ottoman Empire, certain, the boundaries did change. I have people, that are Greek, but they say they come from Turkey because they lived in an island near the border within 20 miles of Turkey. So,
Yep.
so at a certain period, I think they may have thought of this particular island as being Turkish, when in fact it presently is Greek.
Which is why Eastern European research is so hard because of all the border changes. And again, I've got to learn the history of that area in order to know. There's also, I believe it's the 1920 census. If you read, the other thing to do, if you're doing a lot of census research, is get the instructions that were given to the enumerator because it will help you distinguish some of those columns where they put codes and little things. I believe it's the 1920 census where the enumerators were actually told, if the person tells you they're from this country, write down that country. And it has to do with keeping, borders changing and wanting to be somewhat standardized so that when they did their statistics, they would have a better chance of getting everything down and having things match. So those enumerator instructions can be very interesting, but definitely tracking that history and those border changes makes a big difference. And my example I have for you is my husband's Slovak side, so you'll see how those names change too.
If anyone has been working with Ancestry.com, you'll find that they don't give you the results with the exact spelling of what you think is the correct spelling, but they'll give you alternate words that may be the same, have been misspelled. And so these websites like Ancestry or Family Search are good because they will provide quite a number of different databases to give you the answers you want. So something, if you want to check out those websites, you might like to because it certainly is very worthwhile.
A lot of people, depending on where you came from, when they get on the boat, the guy who was writing down the name never even looked up.
Right,
I have a friend.
according to how you said it.
His
So.
grandfather was from Ireland, and of course he went to Wayland and come to the States, and his name was Lee Marie, typical Irish name. But the guy writing the name down just turned it into an anglicized. His name is William Ryan. And all his life, every time people say, hi, Bill, he was called Bill Ryan. He says, your name is Lee Marie, not Bill Ryan. And that happened in many, many places.
Yeah. And I would definitely, if you're going somewhere where you know you have to do this sound X, do it for every spelling you have, because you might as well look them all up while you're there. And it's not that complicated to figure it out, there's only 10 digits, so it's worth learning how to do. So now I want to find those naturalization records, but maybe they're not in the most obvious of places, so where am I going to look for some of this information? I am going to look at the person's death records. If it was something they're proud of, it's probably going to be mentioned in an obituary. It may or may not be on a death certificate. Sometimes you can get information about where people came from, depends who filled it out and how much they knew about the person. I'm going to look in court and land documents, because sometimes it will say in there, in the description of a deed, it might say, to John Brown, a naturalized citizen. That would be a big hint. I'd like to see that. World War I draft cards. I want to look at those because they did ask on some of them, are you a naturalized citizen? If you have somebody, I always have to read this because I will never get it all memorized. There were 3 registrations for World War I, and they all asked if the person was naturalized. But on the 3rd one, which would be people that were born between 1872 and 1900, they actually expanded it, and they asked if they were a citizen because of their father's naturalization. So in other words, were you a minor when your father naturalized? Which would tell you, don't look for this guy's, look for his father's naturalization, and maybe would give you some feel for when, a date range. So that's if they were born between 1872 and 1900, and you find a World War I draft card, you want to pay attention to that mark. Military information or documentation, any homesteading, again, employment records, any of these things you can find. Again, think about how many forms you filled out and what kind of information you put on them. We're looking for information before all the rules about you can and can't ask. So we may find some of these things. Even if they are done at the courthouse, a legitimate, like a today courthouse that we're thinking of, naturalization records may not be stored in the same places as all the other court records. And people who work at the court may not even know that they have these records. So you may have to press them a little bit. You may have to explain to them, but I've researched it, I know they're supposed to be here, we think they're in a different kind of a book, who can I talk to, who's got the old archive kind of access and things. Of course, there's going to be changes on naturalization depending on world events, so we want to keep that in mind. There's going to be a lot less people, or maybe more people, depending on with the wars and things of when they were getting naturalized, so we might want to take that into account. And we have to keep track of what the department was called, right? At one point it was the INS department, so Immigration and Naturalization Services. Now it's the U.S. Customs and Immigration Service, so it's USICS now. So we want to keep an eye out for those kind of changes as well, so that when we're looking at these federal documents, we know where to look for them. And 1940, they bring in the Alien Registration Program. Some of you who are a little bit older than I am might remember going to the post office with Grandma and Grandpa if they had to do this every year, where they had to fill out a little card once a year because they weren't a citizen and just document that they were here. I've heard lots of stories about people that remember going with people down to the post office to take care of that. So, my husband's great aunt. Little did my brother-in-law know. He wants to do his genealogy research, so I let him do that side of the family. It's fine by me. However, last year, I took 4 paper boxes of information, plus whatever information my brother-in-law had on Ancestry, and I wrote up the family history. Because I refused to give my brother-in-law these things and have them sit in his closet when there were all kinds of cool stories. So I started looking at what my brother-in-law had on Ancestry. Well, he's a gatherer. He goes through Ancestry, and oh, that's a good document, and I'll keep it, and I'll keep it, and I'll keep it. And he gets all excited when he finds these Slovak documents, but he doesn't always know what the heck he's got. Shame on him. So Rosalie Ivankovich is how we pronounce it now. We also spell it differently than that. But she came over in 1901 with her mother. Oh no, she came born in 1901. She came over in 1920 with her mother. So I know she's an immigrant. I also know she naturalized. So I have 6 different documents here that I might find for her, right? She should be on a passenger list. She could have been detained at Ellis Island, which is a whole other document. I have a chance that she got a certificate of arrival because she's in the right time frame. And then I know she naturalized, so I have the 3 documents over here. Well, it turned out that my brother-in-law had 5 out of these 6. He had no idea what a gold mine this was to have 5 out of these 6 documents. So here's the passenger list. Rosalie and her mother Susanna came over. They came from Dubrava, and they were going to Phillipsburg in New York. Well, except that Phillipsburg is in New Jersey, but you know, that's okay. They got here. Now, this is the passenger list, and I meant to blow this up this morning, and I forgot because I had insomnia last night, so I slept late this morning. Over Rosalie's name, there's some numbers here and a date. The date says 7/24/41. Because that is when she must have applied for the next oh no. All right, we'll remember that date for the next one. Here's where they were detained at Ellis Island. All right, she's 19 years old. She's coming in with her mother, 2 unaccompanied females. What are they going to be asked?
Are they married?
Where are you going? Who's going to take care of you? What's going to happen? So they came in on the 29th of June. They were released from Ellis Island on July 1st. I know from this document that they were fed between the 2 of them, 4 breakfasts, 2 lunches, and 4 dinners. And because they were there partly in June and partly in July, it actually breaks it out and says how many of those were in June and how many were in July. I can make some big assumptions here that in between June 29th and July 1st, Rosalie's brother was probably contacted down in Phillipsburg, New Jersey, and asked, are you going to take care of your mother and your sister? I can assume that he said yes, because his mother lived with him for the rest of her life. The sister finally she got married, moved to New York, and you know, whatever, we'll see that. But I can make some educated assumptions. I can't prove it. I don't have a phone record. I don't have the letter that they might have sent to my husband's grandfather to say, you know, will you take care of these women? But I'm pretty sure from historical that that's what probably happened. Here's Rosalie's certificate of arrival. August 1st, 1941. That date on the passenger list was July of 41. The number on the passenger list in handwriting matches this number. So the government at this point in 41 was smart enough to lock these 2 documents together and be able to say that if somebody came looking to prove their immigration and ask for citizenship, they had better show document number, you know, whatever that is. They wrote it right on the passenger list. So here's another hint. If you're looking at that passenger list and you're seeing those kind of numbers and dates written on there probably is some follow-up paperwork. They probably asked for something else as part of naturalization. So great, doesn't tell me anything that wasn't already on the passenger list, but it's another document. It's another tracking of what she was up to. Here's her declaration of intent with a picture. Not a great picture, but it's a picture. I think it's the only one we have of her. By here she's married. But this is why you want, you know, here's a declaration. It tells me a lot about when she came, who she came with. This even gets into her marriage. It tells me about her kids that she currently has. Yay! There's a story on this piece of paper, right? Lots of information and a picture. And here's her petition for naturalization, which is from, I don't remember the date that's on it.
September
41. Yeah. Yeah, I don't know, there's a lot of dates, but whatever. So again, more pieces to her story of how she got here, what she was doing. And so, page 2, oh, that's what I wanted, page 2, yeah, because she didn't really get her citizenship until 1944, which happened to be a presidential election year. And there were two big candidates running, let me see if I have it written down here. There were two big candidates running from New York. No, oh wait, backside over here. Yeah, I didn't write it down on this one, but I have a feeling that she probably got her citizenship so she could vote in the presidential election. I can't prove it, right? But it's my gut feeling of why, if you've waited 24 years from the time that you were eligible to do this, why get started now? Probably because of the politics going on and what was happening, right? Her husband's still alive, so it's not like she, feels like she needs to be a citizen to be an independent woman or anything, so I'm guessing it was the election. But until I explained to my brother-in-law what all these documents were, he had no clue that he had such a big piece of information on his family history. Because he just gathered and never analyzed what he had.
How did he get these documents, just by Googling?
He got awful darn lucky. Most of these he got, these were all on Ancestry. He managed to find all of these, on either Ancestry or Family Search, because those are the two big sites that he uses. And they're not the Slovak. I have a bunch of Slovak documents he got, but those came from other places and other groups that he goes to.
Excuse me, could I just say one thing?
Sure.
One of the great sources for additional information will come from other families that are doing research who may be researching your family also. So my suggestion, based on my experiences, to have a DNA test done. It's only, I think it's not down around $50, and it'll tell you, the DNA will tell you where you came from, what regions you were likely to have, your ancestors have been, and then they'll give you a printout, not a printout, but they'll provide a list of other family tree people that are likely, not always, likely to be related to your family. And if you're able to access their family tree, you may very well find a connection of some of the people on your family tree with your family. So getting a DNA test would really provide you with a lot of information, because they'll automatically give you names of people that you may be likely related in some way. They could be maybe a sixth cousin, seventh cousin, but they will also tell you which ones are your most likely family trees.
But that's, you can collaborate without using DNA tests as well. Even any of the sites where you build a tree online, if they allow you to search other people's trees, search for them. Use the message boards to write to people that have your ancestors in their tree and say, what do you have? They don't have to, because the DNA takes a lot of work to figure out. And not everybody's up for it. So you want to know that there's other options as well to contact these people. I know on Ancestry, I always have a list on the side that says, these are names I'm searching, and I can click on it. It'll tell me other people that are searching those names and things. So yeah, collaboration is great, but DNA is not the only way to get there.
But I have to say, Howard, I feel that it's really important. Having a DNA test is just taking a little saliva and sending it to the company. But they will automatically provide you with a list of family trees that you are likely to be related to in some way. It's an alternative to that. You could also do it your way too. But
it's an alternative, but it
I
requires some work, and you have to have done some research first. Because a lot of what the DNA is going to tell you is people that match your 4th, 5th, and 6th great grandparents, and if you don't know who those are, it doesn't help you.
Well, that I kind of agree. But it's a process. So you get a little bit from this way of researching, a little bit of another way of searching.
And that's why groups like this are good too, because you come together and you get to talk to people about, hey, I'm kind of stuck on this, do you have any ideas? People look at problems from different perspectives, and that's what we're looking for, is that different perspective to say, well, I didn't think to look for that kind of a record, or I didn't think to tackle it from the other side. So you want to get those kind of perspectives, and I know that's what this group does, because I've been here enough times to hear other things they've talked about and things where they're sharing their stories and their research. So, thank you very much for coming and being so attentive.